Good morning. Welcome to our panel discussion on the Canada-U.S. energy relationship. My name is Steve Reed. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson in Washington, D.C., and for the last 30 years or so I've been specializing in U.S. federal energy regulation, and for the last 20 years, particularly with respect to Canada-U.S. energy relationships, representing our good friends from Enbridge who are here. Before I introduce our three distinguished panelists, I wanted to say just a few words about our overall topic. As you all know, we live in a world with a growing appetite for energy in all forms, and as a result, developments in the energy sector spark a great deal of interest, not just from industry insiders, but from the general public as well. We only have to think about the news stories that have dominated the headlines for the last several months. A nuclear disaster in Japan that is raising questions around the world about the future of nuclear power, political developments in the Middle East leading to rising oil prices that threaten the economic recovery around the world, as well as impacting people directly at the gas pump. And closer to home in terms of the Canada-U.S. energy relationship, ongoing controversy in the U.S. over whether to issue a presidential permit for the Keystone pipeline that's been referred to earlier today to carry crude oil from Western Canada to the U.S. Gulf Coast, which has featured an aggressive public campaign on both sides. Living in Washington, I even hear ads on the radio these days driving to work, pro and con on the Keystone pipeline, a truly unforeseen development. In short, this is an unusually pivotal time in the world energy sector. Important and far-reaching decisions are being made daily that are going to affect industries in both countries and the public as well. With that background, we are truly fortunate to have with us three distinguished and knowledgeable panelists who can give us valuable insights into the issues affecting the Canada-U.S. energy relationship today. First up today will be John Felmy, to my immediate right, Chief Economist of the American Petroleum Institute in Washington. John has a long and extensive background in the energy industry, stretching back more than 30 years. A PhD economist from the University of Maryland, John is responsible for overseeing the economic, statistical, and policy analysis done at API, which is an organization that represents more than 400 members of the all aspects of the petroleum industry. Our second speaker today will be Steve Winberg, second to my right, who is the Vice President for Research and Development and Coal Conversion and Power Development at Consol Energy in Pittsburgh. Like John, Steve has more than 30 years of experience in many aspects of the energy industry, including such leading topics today as carbon capture and sequestration, coal to liquids conversion, greenhouse gas limitation technology, and other areas. I would also point out that Steve has his MBA from the University of Pittsburgh, and John is a graduate of Penn State, so I hope we can keep the Panther-Nittany-Lion rivalry to a minimum here. Our last speaker, and last on the right, is Danielle Droid, who is the Director, U.S. Policy for the Pembina Institute in Washington. The Pembina Institute is an organization dedicated to analyzing and supporting sustainable energy solutions. Danielle, I would note, was originally from the Washington area where I live, Arlington, Virginia, but moved to Canada with her husband, where she became the Executive Director of Water Matters in Alberta, before coming back to the U.S. to take her current position at Pembina in 2010. So without further ado, I will turn this over to the panelists, and we'll hopefully reserve a few minutes at the end for questions and answers. John?
Thank you very much. I'm truly honored to be here. This is a very important topic at a critical time for both our countries. And what I'd like to do is share with you my thoughts in terms of energy, where we're going, and more importantly, where we shouldn't go, and what mistakes we shouldn't repeat that we've done in the past. But before that, I thought I'd share a little history of our industry with you all. If you heard the President's State of the Union address, he called the oil industry an old industry. Well, that's right. We are over 151 years old, and the industry started August 27th of 1859. And so a year and a half ago, about 60 of us, 50 energy geeks in Washington, got together, hired a bus, and took 6-hour drive up to Oil City in Titusville. That's kind of a daunting thought of having that many geeks on a bus for that long, but we entertained ourselves with lectures and briefings and so on, and so it was really exciting. For those of you who have never been there, this is the memorial to Colonel Drake. The burial place is in front of it. So we visited that in Titusville. We also visited the world's oldest operating oil well. This is the McClintock #1 well. This operates once a year. It's been operating since 1860. They produce a little oil, and they sell that oil in the Drake Well Museum. Now, they sell that oil for a 2-ounce bottle or 1-ounce bottle for $2. Now, how expensive is that? Does anybody know how many ounces there are in a barrel of oil? Well, there's 42 gallons, of course, and you multiply times 128, you get 53.76. So that oil sells for almost $11,000 a barrel. Pretty good. We also visited the original site of the industry. This rather small area is the National Trust designation. That's where it all started, with Colonel Drake producing commercial oil. And we visited one of the bigger gushers of oil places that they had, a real boom town. This is a quaintly named place called Pit Hole. This was a town that they had gushers of oil of 100 barrels a day. A town sprung up with 15,000 people in it. It was the 3rd largest post office in Pennsylvania. They pumped oil for 500 days. The oil ran out. They tore everything down and left, and you had no idea that there was actually oil produced there. And I bring that up because every time I hear our opponents saying, oh, once you produce oil, it'll be horrible forever. Well, that's of course not true. Now, they also sell oil here in a little museum. Nobody lives here, but they have a museum. And they sell that 1-ounce bottle for $5. So that's $27,000 a barrel. Pretty good. And I'll close with my history lesson, is that I also did a lecture on it. Now, yours truly, I was tasked with talking about a very important pipeline in the United States, since we've been talking about Keystone, and I personally am very excited about the prospect of that line being developed. I talked about the original major pipeline in the United States. The Tidewater Oil Line. It ran from Bradford, Pennsylvania, northwest, all the way down through Williamsport, Muncie area, ultimately to Bayonne. It was a cast iron line, screwed together with collars, dug by hand, and it was built by the independents who were trying to break John D. Rockefeller's hold on rail transportation, because he had monopolized the rails, and so they were producing oil, but they couldn't ship it anywhere, and so they built this line, finished it in 1879, ran it for a few years, and then sold out to John D. as part of one of the original Standard Oil Trusts. They made a lot of money, they did good, and so on. Well, the reason I was lecturing on it is I worked on this line as a kid. No, not in 1879, but I did work on it as a kid, and so that's how I got my start in the oil business. So I started off with an honest job, and then I turned to the dark side, became an economist. And so since I've never seen most of you folks before, it gives me the opportunity to tell you an economist joke. What's the definition of economist? Well, of course, there are many. But my favorite one is an economist is somebody who's real good with numbers, but doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. So where are we as an industry? You know, in Washington, everybody's saying you're an old industry, you're going to disappear, you know, da-da-da-da, you know, all the rhetoric that you hear. Well, we're an industry that's responsible for 9.2 million jobs. 7.5% of gross domestic product, as Carl mentioned, a very important sector, but yet we're dismissed as being just an old industry that doesn't contribute much. We're also an industry that's owned by tens of millions of Americans. Probably every one of you here owns a piece of an oil company, whether you know it or not, either through IRAs, pension funds, fully 40% of the equities of the companies, and then money market funds and everything else. You know, half the states have major investments. And so when you hear people proposing to tax the oil industry, we're going to tax the industry, we're going to take money from them, grab your wallet, because it's probably coming out of your pocket, whether you know it or not. And that's just another example of Washington where, you know, you can choose to demonize people and things and so on, and it has no basis in reality. So let me turn to markets right now, because of course that's what everybody's asking, and it's a fundamental to what our energy policy is. This is a graph that I show just to help explain a very simple relationship between crude oil, gasoline, and diesel fuel. The blue line is crude oil in dollars per gallon. You need to make that calculation. There's 42 gallons in a barrel, and so let's see, yesterday oil was $118 a barrel, or about $2.57 a gallon. The green line is gasoline, and the difference between those lines in terms of retail gasoline and crude oil historically has averaged about $1.10 adjusted for inflation. And about 48 cents of that is taxes. And then everything else is refining, marketing, transporting, getting it to consumers, and yes, some earnings in it. Diesel's a little higher because diesel is not your father's diesel fuel. It's been ultra low sulfur diesel, so it's much more expensive to make than what it used to be. And demand for diesel is much stronger both in the US and worldwide. And we've got a much stronger economy going on right now, and so you see a relatively tighter market for diesel fuel. So, looking at the numbers recently, what you can see is from the recent run-up in prices from August up through now, you can explain virtually 100% of the increase in gasoline prices due to three things, or actually four, but three are really identifiable. The first is you've had crude oil prices go up in these points, and this is a couple days ago. Crude oil went up 98 cents a gallon. We had ethanol go up by 90 cents a gallon, and since it's blended at 10%, that's an additional 9 cents. And then you have credit card fees, which are a percentage, usually 2 to 3%. They went up by $1, so another couple cents on that. So you can explain virtually all of that. You also have higher costs of operation in terms of the crude cost is more expensive, so your energy is more expensive, and so on. And so it's not hard to see why you've had gasoline prices go up $1.13. It's pretty much all the rise in costs. And I bring that up because this is really a third-grade arithmetic challenge. But yet we have people who say, oh, it's conspiracy, and you have calls for price gouging investigations and everything else. It's just third-grade arithmetic. But you have to know there's 42 gallons in a barrel, and we haven't done a very good job of it. But that being said, of course, it's very political in Washington right now. So let me ask a question. Does anybody know what the price of gasoline was on January 20th of 2009? Anyone has their guess about what it was? Well, it was less than half what it is today, or $1.84.8. And therein lies the political challenge that's gone up. And why has gasoline gone up that much? Because crude oil's gone up that much. You've had gasoline go up by $1.96, crude oil went by $1.76, ethanol up another, say, 15 cents or so. It explains virtually all of that. Now, why did crude oil prices go up so much? Well, if we look from EIA, it's a function of primarily a whole series of factors. On a day-to-day basis, you have things like the value of the dollar affected, speculation, of course, because in futures markets, every day is speculation because you don't have a close of the contract and so on. You've got a whole host of other things that have real impacts, like OPEC supply, non-OPEC supply. Clearly, OPEC isn't producing as much as they could. But the main factor that I look at is global economic growth and record oil demand. If you look back for a record oil demand from the collapse in 2009, the IEA in 2010 said we had an all-time record demand level, 87.9 million barrels a day. You know, it's an astonishing amount. You know, it's over 30 billion barrels a year. And that they're projecting that to be 89.4 in 2011. In other words, another record demand level. And when you combine that with not a lot of increasing capacity in places like non-OPEC, and certainly here in the US, because of the moratorium, the permatorium, things like that, we've had, you know, obviously a lot of the industry and exploration shut down. We have, of course, most of that growth is China. And you can see that from the green. It used to be the US. We're a player in that. We have an increase in it, but it's not as much as what it used to be. There is limited capacity, and this is something to really think about. We started the beginning of the year with 4 million barrels a day of excess capacity. You have a 1.5 million growth, and you had Libya shut down, so another 1.5 million. So excess capacity is really limited right now, and that's what's driving everything. Let me turn to the energy economy quickly to go through these. This is our economy. Far too complex to really understand. This is the EIA's flows where you have where it comes from, how it's used, line losses, energy losses, and so on. It's a very complex industry, and so anything that you do has to take it into account. I break it down a little bit more by looking at kind of just some simple lumps. And if there's anything that you want to keep from this presentation, I'd suggest this one. Down the left-hand side, it says, where do we get our energy? 37% oil, 25% gas, 21 coal, 8 renewables, and 9 nuclear. And then how it's used. Down the right-hand side, transportation uses a lot, electric power uses a lot, and a lot of that's because 2/3 of the energy going to electric power is lost, either through conversion losses or line losses and so on. If we look then at the petroleum, just break it out this way, it's really the key line on the top is the challenge in terms of energy in a lot of ways. And that's that we use 72% of our oil in transportation, 22% industrial, a lot of chemicals, 5% residential and commercial, and only 1% electric power. And I bring that up because I hear a politician constantly saying, oh, we need solar, wind, and geothermal or nuclear to reduce oil use. How? We don't use any electricity except in Alaska and Hawaii, and we don't have a fleet of electric cars. But yet it's said over and over again as though it has any truthful component at all. The key one, though, is 94% of the fuel of transportation is oil. Now, we do use some other oil, for example, and then I'll just break out natural gas to show you. This is where gas is used. We use a little bit in transportation, a lot industrial for chemicals, things like that, residential, commercial, and electric power. And so 30% of gas goes to electric power. But I'll break down the transportation use. So the challenge we have is if you're going to change that oil number from 94%, it's going to have to come from somewhere else. Yes, we can use more natural gas, and the whole shale gas development is exciting. It's really exciting for me because I was a dirt poor country boy, grew up in north central Pennsylvania, and I remember seismic crews going up and down all those valleys, and I always wondered, what did they find? Well, they found this huge block of shale with gas in it, but didn't know how to develop it. And so it's a wonderful economic development opportunity in that part of Pennsylvania. It could be in Ohio, too. But yet we've got opponents that'll fight everything. And so irresponsibility, I hope, will not stop that wonderful opportunity. Now, can we expand natural gas into transportation? You bet. We can do that. It's a known technology. Boone Pickens' plan for heavy trucks is one. We could use fleets, something like that. It's only a question of cost and time. And that's really a challenge of energy, cost and time, because it's so vast in terms of what we do. We use some renewable energy. We could use more. But the amount of ethanol that you can put into the gasoline pool right now is almost at a max level. Because we use about 137 billion gallons of gasoline. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, it is the Penn State fight song. Sorry. Anyway, we could use more, but if 137 billion gallons of gasoline, it means at 10%, which is only what cars can run on, you are maxed out at 13.7, and we're already going to use 12.6 this year. So these proponents of trying to say we're going to use a lot more biofuels, until you can actually have flex fuel vehicles, you can't do much more than you already have. And I hope we do have flex fuel vehicles. Now let me close with the question on electricity. Where does electricity flow? So I added this to the right, and you can see that only 2.2% of electric power goes to transportation. And so if we don't have a fleet of electric cars, not much is going to happen there. I hope we do have successes in the Chevy Volt and so on, but it's hard to see whether or not technology will actually be successful. I hope we do because we own that. But until you have a fleet of electric cars, these arguments that we're going to reduce oil use by electric cars make absolutely no sense. If you look out in the future, similar to Carl's projections, the energy situation is going to be very much like it is today. The proposals we have are pretty much, well, let's repeat the mistakes of the past by taxing the industry. This has been in the president's budget for the last 3 years. We tried that back in the 70s and 80s. All it resulted in was lower production of oil, increased imports, and then they spent the money down on things that didn't work. Let's not repeat that mistake. We can produce a lot more. We invested $2 trillion in a lot of things since 2000, a vast amount of money. We could produce more in this country. In fact, if you look at increasing Canadian production, increasing U.S. production, you could dramatically lower the amount of imports that come in, far in excess of the 1/3 that the president proposed. But we need to be able to produce that oil, and we need to go into areas that are off limits right now. We have over 100 billion barrels of oil. It's funny, you'll hear people say, oh, we only have 2% of the world's reserves. That's absolutely accurate and totally irrelevant. The fact is we have over 100 billion barrels that we could find, resources, not reserves. And so, but we need to move forward in it. We need a 5-year plan. We need all these things. We also need alternatives. The industry invests more in alternatives than anybody else, over $50 billion over that period. Yes, it's only 5%, but when you compare that to what a reality of energy is, it's not out of line. Because if you think of everybody talks about solar, wind, and geothermal. How much are they of our energy supply? A little more than 1%. So you have people saying, we're going to double it. Great. What's that make? 2%. Where's the other 98% going to come from? And so it's going to be oil, coal, gas. It's going to be oil sands. So we need the Keystone Pipeline. We need all of these things to move forward. On climate change, yes, if you're going to move forward in things, it should meet the following 3 points. 1, it shouldn't pick winners and losers. 2, you don't want to destroy the economy. And 3, you should do it the most effectively possible. Waxman-Markey clearly failed that, and the EPA regulations that they're talking about right now will probably fail that test. So going forward, we're going to need balanced energy. We're going to need all forms of it. We're going to need energy efficiency. And so let's be rational about what we're doing instead of just trying to reach for the silver bullet and soundbite that most likely won't work. And so I want to thank you very much for your time and turn it over to, I guess, the next speaker.
All right, here's the biggest challenge of the day, finding me. I think that's me. Yeah. Right down there. Winberg. It's got to be me. Thank you. Okay, challenge of the day is over with. I'm going to talk today about what some people call the train wreck. It's basically the suite of EPA regulations that will be affecting the coal-fired power plant fleet in the United States. First, the disclaimer. I got the longest one I could because I knew I was talking in front of a group of lawyers. Okay, first let me start with a summary of Consol Energy, then the pending regulations affecting coal. I'm not going to go through each of those regulations in the interest of time. Be happy to talk about them afterward. We'll talk about the impact of the coal fuel generation, and then what I believe will be an impact on natural gas for this reason. As we shut down the coal fleet, there is simply not going to be enough renewable to replace it. I think given the events in Japan, the probability of building nuclear, especially in the next 6 to 8 years, is really off the table. So therefore, the only replacement, realistic replacement, will be natural gas. So let me start off with a summary of Consol. We are headquartered in South Point, Pennsylvania. We've been producing energy since the Civil War. We are $11 billion market cap. We are the largest underground coal producer in the United States. We produce about 60 million tons of high BTU coal, mostly out of the Pittsburgh 8 seam. We have 4.4 billion tons of proven and recoverable coal reserves, and we are the second largest among U.S. coal producers. We've also recently laid a big footprint down in the Marcellus and Utica shale. We purchased $3.5 billion of gas assets from Dominion. They're headquartered in Richmond. So we produce about 155 billion cubic feet of natural gas, and we have 3.7 TCF of net proved reserves. One thing that makes us unique from other gas producers in the Marcellus play is that we own our reserves in fee. We're not under, well, very, very little of that 3.7 is under lease. So we're not under any mad rush to go ahead and drill this reserve. A lot of the producers have 5-year leases, so if they don't produce, they lose the lease. We're also the only U.S. coal company with an R&D facility, and we have 8,600 employees. And then finally, we have the naming rights for the Consol Energy Center, which is where the Pittsburgh Penguins play, so you all come and watch a hockey game with us. Let's talk about these pending regulations. This is a chart that was put together by EEI. It shows the regulations between now and 2017. This is what people call the train wreck. There's a lot of EPA activity underway. I'm going to concentrate on sort of the broad picture, step back from this rather detailed chart. The first regulation on my list, but not the first one that's been sent out for comment, but the first one on my list is the transport rule. It regulates fine particulate. The second one is the hazardous air pollutant rule. This one was released about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think it's 937 pages long. It will require reductions in a suite of hazardous air pollutants. We also have the coal combustion residue rule. This largely is an outcome of the accident that happened at TVA a couple of years ago. And then we have a cooling water intake structure to protect aquatic creatures from getting sucked into cooling water. This regulation may very well require most power plants to have cooling towers for those that do not. And then effluent guidelines. This one isn't talked about much because it's only a proposed, EPA is studying it right now, but they're planning on proposing regulations this year. And then the mother of all regulatory initiatives, of course, is greenhouse gas, which EPA is proposing to regulate under the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I think this one, as stated by the previous speaker, I think this won't be regulated through EPA. Congress will have to deal with this. Transport rule. What this rule is dealing with transport of emissions, primarily SOx and NOx, in an eastward because of prevailing winds, and it accounts for 86% of the U.S. coal-fired generation, basically from Texas east. Okay, so let's talk about coal-fueled generation. There have been a series of studies that have come out, and it's worth pointing out that all of these studies that you see on this table were done in advance of the regulation actually coming out, although there's been some drafts that have hit the street. But these are studies that have been done to determine the impact of these regulations on the coal-fired fleet. The column here in the middle is conventional coal regulations. Said another way, everything but greenhouse gas reductions. And if you look down that column, you see anywhere from a low of about 18 up to maybe 144 gigawatts. This column here is the addition of CO2. So this is a real guesstimate, in my opinion, on what will be the shutdown or the impact of greenhouse gas regulations as well as the criteria pollutant regulations. And it goes up to 159 gigawatts. So what we did, Consol, we have been studying this for about the last year and a half. We made an assumption here. We wanted to bracket the issue, so we bracketed it by looking at this as, in a moderate case, you might see about 40 gigawatts of coal-fueled generation being shut down due to these regulations. In the severe case, it would be 100 gigawatts. So that's the two red bars you see in front of you. Keep in mind we have about 310 gigawatts of generation in the United States that uses coal, and it's about 950 million tons of coal, almost a billion. In fact, back in 2007, it was a billion tons of coal. So what we did then is we took out the announced retirements, and then we added back in the new capacity. And so for the moderate case, what we're looking at is about a loss of about 42 million tons of coal. That's bituminous, which is mostly eastern coal, subbituminous out in the west. The other is the lignite, which is primarily in Texas and also up in North Dakota. So you see about 40 million ton or 4% loss in coal. Under the severe case, we would be looking at about 23% loss in coal. So any of you that are really paying attention to these numbers, the difference between 40 gigawatts and 100 gigawatts is a factor of 2.5. But it's a factor of 5 between 42 million tons of coal lost and 216 million tons. So how can you go from 40 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts but lose 5 by a factor of 5? The reason is the 40 gigawatts represents older, smaller units that don't operate very much, so you don't burn a lot of coal. As you start eating into the fleet and you get up to that 100 megawatt case, these units operate at very high capacity factors, therefore the coal they burn is higher. In fact, a lot of people talk about this train wreck in the 100 gigawatt sense, that if we lose 100 gigawatts of coal-fired power in the next 6 to 8 years, we better call out the National Guard because we're going to have rolling blackouts, and we simply cannot build enough capacity to replace that in that short amount of time. I'm going to build up this slide because there's a lot of information in it, but what I want to talk to you about is the cost of new generation versus the cost of existing generation. Because in what I believe is still a relatively fragile economy, cost is an issue. So, integrated gasification combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration comes in at about $150 per megawatt hour. That's a levelized cost. The next generation, where the Department of Energy wants to go, where Carl Bauer, the road he started these DOE down, would bring that down to about $102 per megawatt hour. Conventional technology is about 151, 110 once we do the R&D and the development on the new technologies that will reduce the cost. So these are, I wouldn't say these are aspirational, I think they're possible, but they're probably 10 to 15 years away before we're commercially ready to put coal-fired power plants on the ground with CCS in that $100 to $110 price range. Here's where the coal fleet sits right now at about $33 per megawatt hour. So you can see there's a pretty significant difference in price. Today's natural gas combined cycle about $83 per megawatt hour, and today's new supercritical pulverized coal without carbon capture and sequestration is about $85. So there's about a $2 megawatt difference. That's really in the band of noise. However, to build out a natural gas plant, you're looking at about 2 years and about maybe $1,500 a kilowatt hour. To build coal, you're probably at $4,000 a kilowatt hour and 6 years away. So there's a time value of money here. I think most of the power generators in the United States will be building out natural gas rather than coal because there's a fair amount of risk in building coal right now, absent regulatory certainty. So let's look at what that does to natural gas if we lose 40 to 100 gigawatts of power. This slide right here shows you gas consumption in the electric power sector and the industrial sector. So if we lose about 40 gigawatts, that's 1 trillion cubic feet of additional gas. If we lose the 100 gigawatts, we're at about 5 trillion cubic feet per gas. And again, that extreme difference is because at 100 gigawatts, these are high capacity factor units. They're operating in the 80-85% range. Now let's look at natural gas production. What this slide shows you is all the sources of natural gas production using 2010 as it's all indexed to 2010. This slide was also put together by the National Energy Technology Lab, part of DOE. So if you add all of those sources of gas together, and I think the one to pay attention to is the lower 48 unconventional. That's the shale plays. That's the Marcellus Shale. That's the Utica Shale. By 2020, we will have about 1 trillion cubic feet of gas over what we have right now. Now, if I index this back to 2007 when the economy was robust, we would be at a deficit right now, or by 2020, but I put it at 2010. So if you believe the economy is going to take off, it will easily absorb this 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas without any additional generation, just bringing industry back. But the point is, with the Marcellus Shale, Utica Shale plays, I believe that we can produce enough natural gas if we lose about 40 gigawatts of power, because that's the 1 trillion cubic feet. Go all the way over to the your right-hand side of the slide at 2.3 trillion cubic feet by 2035. This, again, is EIA's estimate. If we're at that 100 gigawatt loss of coal, we need to bring on 5 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That's going to be a very, very heavy lift for the natural gas industry. And quite frankly, I think it's not possible. So the question is, if we have to bring on that much gas, what is that going to do to the average fossil fuel price and therefore the average price of electricity? I think that's largely unknown, and I think there are a number of factors that make it unknown. Electric price increase will be a function of, one, the timing of the regulation implementation. If EPA provides power producers with more time, then they're not going to be putting this equipment in, and you're not going to see super escalation in things like labor cost and steel costs, and those sort of commodity prices. So clearly the power industry needs more time than is currently set up in the regulatory structure. Otherwise, we are going to see escalation, significant escalation. Second, of course, is the price of natural gas. Price of natural gas stays down in the levels where it's at. I think you will see a lot of people shutting down older, smaller units and building natural gas. If the economy recovers in the next couple of years and we see prices moving towards that $6, $7, $8 per MCF range, I think people are going to be installing capital in existing fully depreciated plants rather than going to natural gas. And then finally, I think the real issue between the 40 gigawatt loss and the 100 gigawatt loss is what happens with CO2. Are you going to put hundreds of millions of dollars of capital into a plant that's 20 or 30 years old if you think you're going to have carbon legislation in the next 10 to 15 years? Because you need to get a return on that capital. So I think that's going to play a significant role in the decision making of these companies on whether they invest in existing infrastructure, existing power plants, or build new with natural gas. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker, and I look forward to your questions.
I might need some help. Who's going? I'm a Mac person, so I don't want to. Yeah, great. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Danielle Droid. I work with the Pembina Institute. We're a Canadian environmental think tank. We're based out of Canada. There's now a Washington, D.C. office, which is me. Our focus is on energy solutions. So we work in 4 program areas: oil sands, energy efficiency, renewables, climate change, and transportation. Many people don't know this about us, so for those who don't know, we are partly a consulting firm and partly a policy outfit. The consulting firm, we have engineers, a number of technicians, policy analysts who provide services to provincial, federal, and local communities, as well as NGOs and a business. We also have a policy arm, which is where I work, and we actually engage directly in energy policy at all levels. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 of the areas that we work on today, which is climate change and oil sands. I'll warn you now, the presentation will begin a little bit in the negative end and sort of a downer, but I promise you that by the end of the presentation, it will be more hopeful. So, I promise you, because I knew I'd start off with climate change. So, climate change is one of the reasons we do what we do. Scientists are painting an increasingly dire picture of the nature of climate change and the impact on the planet. If we do nothing, sea level rise will increase by 1 meter. It would permanently displace tens of millions of people with disastrous social and economic effects. Water shortages alone from glaciers would actually impact 25% of the population. It has been described as the biggest global health threat in this century, which would have tremendous impacts on water, food security, and extreme events. The extreme seasonal heat would actually have a particular impact on rain-fed agriculture. In some countries in Africa, rain-fed agriculture would be reduced by 50%. And up to 40% of species globally would become extinct. This is if we do nothing. Now in Canada, there will be impacts as well. The average temperatures in the Canadian provinces will increase by 2 to 6 degrees centigrade, with the largest increases in the Arctic. There'll be an increase in heat-related deaths. There's more drought, which will have a profound impact on water supply, particularly in the western provinces. There'll be stress on wildlife from the declining sea ice, more severe winter storms, shifting ecosystems, loss of wetlands, and it will impact our Canadian icon species, polar bears, seals, caribou, ducks. The sea level rise will, of course, impact Canada's Arctic areas in the Atlantic Canada, the Beaufort Sea, and the Fraser River Delta. And would also have stress on forests for more drought, favorable conditions to pests, and to increase mortality for susceptible tree species. So the growing consensus, and I apologize, the slide is not, it's a little bit bitmapped there. We must do whatever is possible to not exceed a warming threshold of 2 degrees centigrade. Above 2 degrees centigrade, warming is regarded as dangerous climate change, the point at which there's irreversible ecological damage and reversing human development. Unfortunately, it's happening faster than previously estimated. Already, global surface temperatures have increased by 0.7 degrees centigrade already, above pre-industrial levels, due mainly to a buildup in the atmosphere of greenhouse gas emissions. Even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions today, we would still see a warming that would double from existing emissions in the atmosphere. So our work around climate change is closely linked to our work around the Canadian oil sands, which is also known as the tar sands. Tar sands and Canadian oil sands are the one and the same. So this is a key aspect in Canada. It's a fairly major issue. It's generated a tremendous amount of controversy and now in the US in addition to Canada. There's 1.7 trillion barrels that underlie portions of northern Alberta. Today, there's 175 billion barrels that are recoverable under today's technology and what is considered economic. The area that is underlied is 54,000 square miles, about the size of Florida. There's 2 types of extraction methods, surface mining and in situ or drilling, which I'm going to cover both. The area affected by oil sands development would be about 1.5 times the size of Yosemite National Park. Mining is water intensive, energy intensive, and land intensive. Water intensive in terms of 2 to 4 barrels of water required for every barrel of oil. Land intensive, you need about 4 tons of material, and it's energy intensive as well. One of the major issues is the creation of major tailings ponds. There's a number of environmental issues. I can't get into all of them today, but one of the issues that we're particularly concerned about are the tailings ponds, which are more like lakes. Essentially, you need water in the production process, and 90% of the water that's withdrawn from mostly surface water cannot be returned to the environment. So there is water recycling, but the reality is 90% of the water cannot be returned. So it goes into these lakes because they're too contaminated. The lakes right now cover about the size of Washington, D.C., and they're projected to grow. Even with current regulations in Alberta, they were projected to grow. The impact of these ponds on bird populations. I wanted to mention this because a lot of people look at these tailings ponds and say, well, that's in Canada, so it doesn't affect me. But in fact, these ponds are actually right on the pathway, North American bird pathway, where birds basically see these ponds, they've mistaken them for lakes, and they actually land on the lakes. There's been 2 reported incidents of bird deaths over the past couple thousand birds over the past couple of years. But we estimate, Pemmon Institute, NRDC, and the Boreal Songbird Initiative put together a study where we actually estimate, because we don't know about all the bird deaths, so there's about 8,000 or more bird deaths annually due to these types of incidents. The other type of extraction is in situ, which is drilling. So basically they eject hot water into the ground, they soften the bitumen, and then they bring it back to the surface. Now, it's been described as the environmentally friendly alternative to mining, but it actually has major impacts, particularly in the area of greenhouse gas emissions, which I'll get to in a second. But in situ is still an intensive land use. You'll need roads, seismic lines, pipelines, you need well pads, so there's still impacts to that landscape. This area here is a satellite image that shows an area that would actually be subject to in situ development. We worked with some partners and actually came up with a projection of what this area would look like if we were to project into the future. And this is what in situ development would look like for that region. So there's still a fairly intensive land use. If you're wildlife, you would not want to be habiting this area. Right now, we already see declining populations of caribou, lynx, and wolverine. We know that with oil sands development, totally, mining and in situ, that there's the woodland caribou is projected to become locally extinct, extirpated, because of this type of development. One of the major concerns around in situ, well, oil sands in general is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Oil sands in general is some of the most greenhouse gas intensive oil on Earth. Without stronger government policies, emissions from this sector will grow by 2 to 3 times by the end of the decade, and it is what is putting our attainment for Canada's national emissions target at risk. Now, going back to in situ for a moment, you can see here that in situ is actually 2.5 times more intensive than mining. So that is one of the concerns with in situ. While it is not actually the environmentally, the more environmental alternative, at least when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, mining is actually still far more greenhouse gas intensive than conventional. So the concern is still there for mining. So the Keystone XL pipeline, this has been already mentioned a few times. It's a major debate in the United States. So this pipeline is a significant pipeline. There hasn't been much controversy over previous pipelines, but this pipeline is actually initially rated at 700,000 barrels a day and will be ultimately 900,000 barrels a day. And to give you a sense of how big that is, that's about the size of the amount of oil sands that's actually coming to the United States. So this is a doubling of imports, and that's why there's so much controversy. Greenhouse gas emissions is a big part of that. The pipeline is about 1,700 miles long. It would carry crude from Canada down to the Gulf Coast, go through 6 states. And there's a number of impacts in the United States. There's no time to kind of go through those today, but pipeline safety, impacts to the Ogallala Aquifer are 2 of them. In Canada, our organization is very concerned about the fact that this pipeline, in our estimation, would actually have an increased impact on production. That's counter to the estimation of some studies that have been coming out recently saying Keystone XL would have no impact on production, but we disagree. So the pipelines actually raise some very important questions. Does this pipeline and Canada's oil sands bring the U.S. more energy security? Well, what is energy security? There's as many definitions of energy security out there as there are opinions. So it's basically become a very polarized discussion, and it's unfortunate. But the International Energy Agency, one of the world's most respected organizations tracking energy issues, has defined energy security as a function of 3 things: price, environmental impacts, and the source of supply. Now, when it comes to Canada, there's no doubt that Canada is a friendly country. So if you're going to get oil from Canada versus Middle East, there's going to be no comparison there. But when you're looking at the environmental impacts, oil sands is high impact oil. It just is. It's got tremendous impacts associated with it, especially for greenhouse gas emissions. And then when it comes to price, there's a bit of a conventional wisdom. Somehow the price issue is resolved with oil sands. You need high oil prices to have oil sands be economic. So you need high gas prices in order for this source of energy to become a source of energy to the United States. So in terms of price, you're not going to have lower gas prices with oil sands. Now, the problem with this is really where I wanted to end up. The problem with oil dependence. Yes, the U.S. has less than 2% of the world's oil supplies and is responsible for 1/4 of the world's oil consumption. The growing consensus, and this is not just the environmental community anymore, is that the U.S. must significantly reduce oil demand. There's 2 reasons for that. Because we are so reliant on oil, we are not in the driver's seat. The OPEC cartel is in the driver's seat. We are so addicted to oil, we are now going after the harder and harder to reach oil, which is having environmental ramifications. The absolute best way for us to not be held hostage to the ups and downs of the global oil market is to reduce our dependence on the oil itself. And I can't emphasize that more strongly. We have got to start getting control of the oil dependence. So more oil, whether it's offshore drilling, oil shale, oil sands, going after those sources and trying to satiate this addiction is actually not going to help us with the energy security debate. And I'm talking about economic issues, not environmental. The other reason we need to reduce our demand for oil is to protect our climate. According to the IEA, oil demand needs to peak by 2018 if we are to avert major climate disaster. If we are to continue business as usual in terms of the growth of fossil energy consumption, the long-term concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and this is according to the IEA, would result in global average surface temperatures of 6 degrees centigrade. That is massive climatic change and would result in irreparable damage to the planet. So we have to get after the oil demand. Now, as my colleague from the API pointed out, how do we get started? Well, transportation is where we're going to have to begin. Transportation is where most of the oil is being consumed at this time. Right now, we're going to have to be more aggressive with energy efficiency, vehicle efficiency, which can go a long way to reducing oil demand. The Obama administration established fuel efficiency standards for automobiles and light trucks, and this is just the beginning. There's going to be now first ever fuel efficiency standards for medium and heavy duty trucks. Trucks consume more than 2 million barrels every day, and they only average 6 miles per gallon. Boosting fuel economy also creates jobs too. It is estimated, one study estimated that as many as 124,000 new jobs would be created nationwide simply by going after fuel efficiency. Now, there is any number of ways for us to start going after this oil demand, and we could have a seminar for 2 days simply just on going through the different opportunities to go after oil demand. But how much oil can we save? And this is really where we have to begin the national conversation. And it's already started. Obama has certainly made some statements as of late to say, how can we go after? And he's basically said we can cut oil by 1/3. Yes, we can. It's entirely possible. It's not pie in the sky. Now, this is an NRDC graph. It is basically, there's two pieces here. The clean energy, basically a projection if we were to make investments in fuel economy, building efficiency, advanced biofuels, changing making air travel more efficient, smart growth, transit, electric vehicles. So if we were to basically make more investments in these essentially low-hanging fruits, still going to be difficult, still going to be hard, but we can do it. Basically, we can save 10 million barrels a day by 2030. Others have estimated, EPA has estimated we can cut oil use by 7 million barrels a day by 2030. And there's others that are more aggressive. The Rocky Mountain Institute, in collaboration with the Pentagon, put out a study that said we can actually reduce oil demand altogether by 2050. There's lots of debate about how far you can go, but the reality is that we can actually make serious cuts. Now, that red section there is actually, this is proposed drilling in the lower offshore drilling and Arctic refuge. So the point of this slide from NRDC is that we can actually do more by actually making investments to reduce oil demand than going after offshore drilling. I am personally convinced that we can save oil in a profound way, but we have to overcome what has become a politically protracted fight. This is not a Democrat or Republican piece. We have to reduce oil for energy security and to protect our climate, and I hope that all of you will join in that fight. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I think that was a very enlightening discussion. Certainly represented a broad spectrum of opinion on these issues. And I also want to commend the panelists on sticking to their time limit, so I think we do have some time now to take questions from the audience. I think you all know the rules. You have to come up to the microphone and identify yourself. So let's take questions now.
I'm going to be the natural gas guy today. No. Danielle, thank you to all of you. Tim Kennedy with Spectre Energy. Your last slide was clean energy. Does Pembina include natural gas as a clean energy source? We heard that President Obama includes natural gas. So what's Pembina's perspective on that? Thanks.
I don't think that particular slide includes it, but that's just basically showing savings using those particular measures, energy efficiency and that sort of thing. Pembina is certainly views natural gas as part of the mix. We're actually just undertaking a new study on natural gas right now. Obviously, it's the issues around environmental concerns, but we view it as part of the transition process in terms of climate change.
Just a point of clarification, with Obama's clean energy strategy, CES, natural gas gets half a credit, if you will. So to reach 80% clean energy by 2035, if you used 40% of the natural gas produce, or if electricity was produced by 40% natural gas, then there would be no coal, and everything else would have to be nuclear, wind, or solar. So just 40% is as much natural gas as we could use for power generation, and then no coal at all. So the math is a little bit difficult to work through.
Next questioner.
Hi, my name's Ryan Scott. I'm with the Consumer Energy Alliance, and I wanted to ask Mr. Winberg if he had a reaction to the Cornell study that came out earlier this week about greenhouse gas emissions related to natural gas and the fugitive emissions and how that affected the life cycle footprint.
Yeah, I haven't read through the study yet. I think it's actually not out in its final form. There's some bootleg copies that have been floating around. But as I understand, a couple of things that study did is they attributed a 20-year life cycle, if you will, to methane emissions from natural gas. Mostly that's done over a 100-year period, so that's going to necessarily make natural gas look worse. Number two, I think I heard, I have not read, but what I've heard is that they used a global warming factor that was higher than the 21 or 23 that is often used when you put it on a CO2 equivalent basis.
I think it was 70 to 1 instead of 20 to 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's obviously going to make the picture look a lot worse. I always have a little difficulty with life cycle emissions, whether it's from coal or natural gas or nuclear or even wind or solar. There's a lot of latitude that you can put into the calculations. So I think there'll be a lot of people looking at it. You'll have a whole variety of opinions on whether it's accurate or not, but at the end of the day, it'll be 15 minutes and then we'll be on to the next thing.
Can I ask you one more on your slide you had, one of your slides you had the cost per megawatt hour of coal going from 150 to 102 with carbon capture and sequestration.
Right.
What's the big change? You mentioned, I saw on the graph there was a second generation of carbon capture and sequestration. There's some certain technology or cost cutting?
Yeah, there's a number of technologies out there. Air separation units being one of them. Instead of using cryogenic, we'd go to membrane air separation units. There's also some membrane technologies that can be used to strip the CO2 out. A lot less power intensive, a lot lower capital cost. At least right now they anticipate a lot lower capital cost. There are probably a dozen or so technologies, going to a higher efficiency turbine, more hydrogen in the turbine, those types of things that will reduce the cost.
Thank you.
I'm Dick Cunningham with Steptoe & Johnson. I practice with 500 of my closest friends, one of whom is on the panel, the moderator here. In efforts to achieve a clean energy world, how important is increasing the price of carbon fuels? And as a related question to that, and I want to focus on natural gas for just a moment, I have some friends in the renewable industry who say natural gas is a bad thing. Not a bridge, it's a bad thing because it retards the increase in the price of carbon fuels, which is necessary to make renewable fuels economical. So if you can comment on both of those, answer the first and comment on the second, I'd appreciate it, from both sides of the podium.
Well, I can tell you that the Pemin Institute absolutely thinks we have to put a price on carbon. There is no way we're going to get out of this mess if we don't. There's obviously multiple ways to do that. Cap and trade was within reach last year and sort of evaporated in the United States. And in Canada, I think there's still interest, but we have a policy of harmonization, which has sort of become a bit of a barrier. But I think we're going to have to do that. I think the challenge is that now that we're looking at politically the challenges around putting the price on carbon, which has been viewed as so essential. What can we do in the interim? What can we do now that we don't have that political lineup? And that's precisely why I think President Obama is moving forward with these clean energy pieces and saying, well, here's what can be done until we can actually bring together that political consensus to have a cap and trade or a carbon tax, which I guess in the United States is much less likely, but in Canada there's more discussion about a carbon tax. But without that, we don't have an even playing field to actually have that competition. Now, on the natural gas piece, I can say that within even my organization, we have the same debates about natural gas and where it is on the bridge fuel. It's certainly not as large as maybe some organizations look at, but there's no doubt that some of the harder to reach, I mean, with all due respect, some of the shale gas, we have serious concerns about that. So in terms of where it actually acts in the bridge fuel piece, that's something that's particularly of interest to us, and that's what our study is going to be, to really say where is it actually in the mix, because we don't want it to actually create a barrier to the development of renewables and energy efficiency, which really are, well, certainly energy efficiency in terms of where we need to be making investments now.
Well, a couple quick things. First of all, yeah, carbon taxes can have an impact. There's no question. I mean, that's just an economist perspective. But in terms of a carbon tax improving the feasibility of renewables, let's say you impose a carbon tax on oil. How does that improve the competitiveness of renewables when there's solar, wind, and geothermal? Those are electricity sources. They do nothing. Okay. Now, a carbon tax on coal, yes, then you can change that. But when you start getting into those positions, you start have, first of all, is it politically feasible when we've got $3.80 gasoline? Unlikely. And then the other thing is you're starting to get in the point where you're picking winners and losers. So if you impose a carbon tax, it's going to hammer coal. And so you're going to have winners and losers across the country in terms of coal producers. States like Ohio, that gets 86% of its electricity from coal, are going to be big losers. And so those are the difficulties you have in terms of putting it in. Yeah, economists think that that's probably an easier way in terms of being able to implement it. But politically, you know, the history is littered with political candidates who proposed 50 cents per gallon gasoline taxes, and the carbon tax would probably be in the same category.
Can I respond also? Okay. Sorry, Governor. Actually, I agree with my colleague that we are not going to have significant reduction in greenhouse gases if we don't have a carbon price. Where I part from her is she also said to get us out of this mess. And I don't think we are in a mess the way she thinks about it. I think our mess actually is more of a budgetary mess and deficit mess. And so I think what is going to happen is we may very well end up putting a carbon tax on energy, but it will have little or nothing to do with climate change. It will have to do with our deficit. And that's why we're going to end up putting a tax on energy, is to get us out of the hole that we're in on the deficit.
You know, there's certainly a real disconnect here in the facts discussed. And Danielle, as I understand it, over half the oil that comes to the U.S. from Canada is already from the oil sands. This is not something new. And I've sat, and I know the challenges you've mentioned: greenhouse gas, water, land reclamation, wildlife. The industry, and we have other people from the industry here, will insist that they're making great strides in dealing with those issues. And it's not a matter whether we're going to have oil sands. We have a lot of it. We're going to have a lot more of it. They do need to deal with those issues. My question for you is there not a carbon tax in Alberta? And how does that work? I understand it's probably not enough, but is it, what is it, $15 a ton? Because John Kerry was talking about a $20 a ton in the U.S. How does that work? Is that having any effect at all? And my question for Steve is, how expensive is it to convert an existing coal plant to natural gas, which appears to be the direction, regardless of what we say? It's going to have to be. And if we're going to have electric cars, as you know, it doesn't make any sense to have a coal-fired plant providing electricity. It's going to be nuclear or natural gas, and then perhaps as a backup, wind. But right now, it's, as you know, it's intermittent. But I'm wondering how expensive that is, because that's clearly where we're headed. Those are two questions, but I'm just curious.
Go ahead.
Okay. Covered off a couple of things there. But I want to start with a question that I expected to get today. So, you know, this question of we absolutely have to do this, don't we? I would like to challenge you and everyone in this audience that right now, the way we invest our energies, whether it's a regulatory, whether it's subsidies, right now we are not dedicating enough regulatory energy to making the other clean energy investments possible. So without that, right now, the trajectory we're on is we need oil sands, right? That's where we are.
Well, no, we are oil.
We already are, but I'm saying we need more, right? So that's the trajectory. We need to bring more. Yeah, so I'm just, my broad message is not so much let's cut off oil sands. That's not the realistic scenario. But if we continue to make the investments we're making in terms of where we put our tax subsidies, where we're putting our regulatory pressure, we will continue to need that oil. So that's a big picture piece. Now on the management of the oil sands themselves, there's a big debate about whether or not the issues are being managed properly. I would suggest that right now we are not doing a good job up in Alberta to manage the problems. There are strides, there are some developments, but if you're looking at the issue, when you're talking about what the problem is, the amount of monitoring the management of the oil sands is far below. And the Royal Society just came out with a paper on this very issue, that we are not doing enough to manage the problems up there. So we've got to get more serious about going after these problems, much more so than what's on the books. And then the final piece was around the carbon tax, so the $15 per ton. That is a carbon tax. The problem is that money does not actually do very much to provide any sort of investment into the other pieces. Right now, that money goes into a central fund. We have no idea whether or not that money is actually taking. The government of Alberta puts out press releases saying it takes off several million cars off the road, but there's actually no proof of that. So there's problems with that system. If we can make that system more transparent, so we understand where the money's going, is it creating incentive, is it actually displacing carbon, then we would be more supportive of it. But because it's not been a transparent process, it's actually been used more as sort of a, here's what we're doing, and it's not really showing us that there's actually much in the way, if at all, an actual carbon reduction. So that's our concern.
Yeah, I would agree. $15 to $20 per metric ton of carbon doesn't move the needle much in terms of investment. It might change people's behavior a little bit, but in terms of the energy delivery infrastructure, it won't change it much. But to get to your specific question to me, converting coal to natural gas, we're not actually going to take that boiler and convert it to a natural gas-fired boiler. The technology doesn't work for a variety of reasons. More likely what will happen is they will repower those existing facilities, or maybe just shut them down and build new gas-fired facilities. Maybe we can strip the boiler out and put in gas-fired turbines and use the existing steam turbines. So there may be some things that can be done to repower existing fleet, but I think the majority of it will be new build.
Just as a point of clarification, I sponsored the first wind energy systems bill in Congress in 1980, and it passed with Norm Mineta and Jim Jeffords. I've never saw it as the answer to all of our problems, but I saw it as one answer. I went to Congress after the Arab oil embargo, and we dealt with solar photovoltaic, you name it. And so we're very much into wind and solar. But I end up looking at the realities, and that's what I'm trying to say is we're going to need all these energy sources. We are going to need them for the foreseeable future, and we need to figure out how to get everything cleaner and secure. I mean, I don't like heavy oil from Venezuela or Mexico or Bakersfield, California any more than oil sands. They're all the same. But we're going to need all this. The real question will be, how does Canada and the U.S. regulate this? How do we manage it toward a cleaner, more healthy future? And we have to take into account the economy and reality, and that's what the conference is all about. That's why I'm glad we have a mixture of opinion here. Steve, this is really an interesting panel. Thank you all.
Thank you, and I think in order to get everyone to lunch, that'll be the last word.
I can just make an announcement about lunch. I mentioned that there are a few things different this year about the conference. I know that you've been in this room for a while, but what we're going to do is just go across the hall to room A61, which is on the diagonal this way. There's a gourmet box lunch prepared of all different shapes and sizes. Grab your lunch. You're welcome to take a health break for about 15 minutes or so, but then we're going to come back to this room promptly at 12:30. So if you could bring your lunch back, and then we'll go ahead and get started.